I normally don't do film reviews for films that have already come out years ago. I did one for Natural Born Killers under special circumstances because I was at the Cinematheque de Nice and I was very curious to see what all the fuss was about. But I decided to return the favour and do it all over again. But for this one film, which in its current state, as we speak right now, is banned in France by court order. I'll explain a little later. But you know what it is? It's Antichrist. Because chaos reigns. You may be wondering, is it still a 16? I don't know if it shows for the inversion as it's filmed on the screen, but it's not 16 or 16 plus. Anywhere else, a film like this would be banned or heavily censored or be restricted to 18 only. In France, they thought it was deemed acceptable initially for 16 and up, which caused a bit of a stir. Ultimately, in the pipeline through a group called Promouvoir, which was a Catholic social conservative group. They attacked La Vie d'Adèle, which is known as Blue is the Warmest Colour, and they also attacked Sausage Party, which is a film I really like. And I'd be more than happy to show you a poster of it on the wall, but that's another story. But nonetheless, they got so much noticia about it that they took it to court. And the higher powers that be, alongside with the CNC, which is the organisation that's their version of the BBFC or the MPAA, unlike the BBFC, unlike the MPA, well, no, it's MPA, they don't have a criteria or fixed set of guidelines that what you can or cannot show. It's just determined between sort of audience members that they sometimes may invite and professionals that are also in there as well, and they determine the suitability of a film, whether it be tout public avec avertissement, 2 ans avec avertissement, 16 ans avec avertissement, ou 8 ans avec avertissement. And the system in France is very unusual. Most countries would never permit a film like this to be seen by anyone at least under 18 or probably ban it. In France, they thought it was fine for 16-year-olds, and it's actually not that common of a rating as much as tout public, or even for that matter, the 12 category, which is usually assigned to films that are typically rated R. Sometimes you get NC-17 and X films that get the 12 restriction, but 16 movies usually tend to be films that have extreme amounts of violence, or explicit sex scenes. So in this instance, we're talking about films like The Evil Dead, the recent Evil Dead Rise, Natural Born Killers, Hardcore Henry, Bones and All. Some difficulty trying to remember all the titles, but those are some of the films that in recent years have been restricted to the 16 and up crowd. Oh yeah, Don't Breathe 1 and 2. It's unusual for a 15 film to be passed at 16 plus, but in the case of Don't Breathe, at least the first one, which was a very strong 15, it had a rape scene involving a man trying to stick a pipette full of his cum up someone, that was given a 16. The sequel, which had more blood and violence, was the same rating as the original. The film X by Ty West, which dealt with pornography and violence, was restricted to 16 and up in France as well. And even though France has much more liberal views about sex than most countries do, Britain and certainly the US included, there have been films that have been restricted to the 16 and up crowd, like, for instance, Rocco, a documentary about the porn star, L'Anatomie de l'Enfer, which is about Rocco and his a woman that tries to force him out of his homosexuality, and it's very explicit. Um, Obviously, this X was threatened with it. Crash, David Cronenberg, and Nymphomaniac Volume 1. Originally, Love was going to get a 16, but they had to bump it up to 18 because of Promouvoir complaining yet again, just like they did with Sausage Party and La Vida Dead, which was a 12, but they wanted it to be like 18 or 16 or perhaps banned. They're very strict, even though, in all fairness, they make Christian evangelical organizations in America look quite vanilla by comparison, if you know what I mean. But those are some of the films that do come to mind. What films that usually tend to be 18 in France are extremely, extremely, extremely rare. Not even Irreversible or it's not even most of Gaspar Noé's films have never been 18 plus. I know. I think Baise Noire was 18. It was a 16 upon appeal. But Love got the 18, and then even I think Saw 3D or Saw 3. By Saw 3D we mean the final chapter, which it's extremely unusual for a film to receive an 18 restriction. But in the case of that, also because it was extremely violent, at least by what French standards is, which tend to have a bit more of a stronger view about that sort of thing than the Americans. Americans will kind of let anything pass as far as violence is concerned. There are some exceptions. I know Infinity Pool had to be cut and trimmed down just to even get an R rating, not only for the sex but for the violence. That scene where he punches a man's face and it's so bloody and brutal. Ugh. So yeah, quite surprising, isn't it? Well, as far as Antichrist is concerned, it is very graphic. We do see scenes of genital mutilation and perhaps castration involving the clitoris. Spoiler alerts for anyone who hasn't seen it, but I personally did not like the film. Not one bit. But I wanted to see it out of curiosity of why it was banned, why it's so controversial, and to see this beautiful woman, the daughter of the great French singer Serge Gainsbourg, carve a piece of a cunt and try to torture Willem Dafoe, bashing something that resembles like a wheel in his balls, and then she jerks him off, and there's blood coming everywhere out of his penis, as well as torturing and putting in his leg the wheeled item with the screw. It's oh yeah, I forgot Destricted, which was an anthology film of sorts. They had, I think, a segment from Larry Clark and the woman who would eventually make 50 Shades of Grey, which also had a quite explicit short of a guy masturbating in like the Mojave Desert or something like. It was funny, but yeah, it was a bit much in some respects. It was very much pornography, but they wanted to present it as, oh, it's art. Got an 18 in Britain, but it was an uncut 18, which for that time was quite bold. You know, coming out a few years after 9 Songs, where they were permitting a lot more unsimulated sex scenes in movies than they ever did. 9 Songs, actually, weirdly enough, is the first film that I've ever seen that has explicit sexual content quite to that level. Not even NC-17 films like Shame or Crash show as much detail as that, because the sex in those particular films is simulated. Graphic, but it's simulated, not unsimulated, or what the BBFC would deem as real sex, which is usually reserved for hardcore pornography that you would see in the R18 category. But because it's used in a context which is artistic, they were willing to be a lot more permissive about it than they normally would. That's the rationale. And that was the rationale behind Antichrist. Sex was not meant to titillate, but it was meant to be art house. One couldn't, anyone can be aroused by anything, including the sight of watching a woman carve a clitoris and watching a man ejaculate blood out of his penis. I just think that's just nasty. That's not sexy. There's no mystery or eroticism behind that. That's just grotesque. It's kind of this sort of S&M or rape type of imagery going on. Bad enough I remember seeing Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I had a scene where we see, blood coming out of a woman, a certain part of her body, after a horrible rape that was aimed at women's. Ugh. That was rated R, by the way. That was not censored or anything. It was an 18 certificate uncut. Let me just remind you. And this was a Hollywood remake of that film, and it was directed by David Fincher. So yeah, tough crowd. So I wish I could say more about the film, but I can't because I think it was awful. No. There are much better horror films out there and films that have explicit imagery than this. I suggest you go see I Stand Alone or Seul contre tout by Gaspar Noé. Much more interesting. If you want to get aroused and kinky watching two people doing it after seeing their little baby child fall to her death. I think it was their son who died falling down. I suppose there isn't anything else there really. Don't waste your time with this. Lars von Trier made Nymphomaniac, and that was a much better film than this. And Mandalay, which I saw recently, which I thought was very provocative and very powerful stuff, especially toward the end. And there's a lot more things to say than chaos reigns. Now, excuse me, I'm going to cut a certain part of my anatomy with this. Skinny Media signing off. Until next time, stay afraid.